The ghosts of Winter Hill. The fog rolled in like a living thing, blanketing the streets of Millbrook in a thick, gray shroud. I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I hurried down Main Street, the streetlights creating hazy halos in the mist. It was unusually cold for October, and an unnatural silence had settled over the town. My name is James Thorne, and I'd moved to this sleepy Maine village 6 months ago, looking for a fresh start after a messy divorce and the loss of my job in Boston. Millbrook had seemed like the perfect place to heal and rebuild, quaint, quiet, and far removed from the chaos of city life. If only I'd known then what I know now. As I passed the old cemetery, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement among the weathered headstones. I turned, squinting into the fog, but saw nothing but gray shadows and darker shapes of monuments. "Get a grip, James," I muttered to myself, quickening my pace. Ever since I'd taken the night shift at the local radio station, my imagination had been working overtime. Too many hours alone in a dimly lit booth, reading news reports and weather updates to an audience I wasn't sure existed. I was so lost in thought that I almost walked right past my destination, the Rusty Anchor, Millbrook's only bar. As I reached for the door, a hand grabbed my arm. I spun around, heart pounding, to find myself face to face with old Tom, town drunk. "Don't go up there, boy," he slurred, his rheumy eyes wide with fear. "They're restless tonight. Can't you feel it?" I gently pried his fingers from my sleeve. "It's just the weather, Tom. Come on, let's get you inside where it's warm." But he shook his head vehemently. "Not the weather. It's them. Up on the hill. They're angry and they're hungry." He leaned in close, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "Winter Hill is waking up." Before I could respond, the door to the bar swung open, spilling warm light and the sounds of conversation onto the sidewalk. Sarah, the owner, stood in the doorway, her usually cheerful face creased with concern. "James, everything okay out here?" I nodded, gently steering Tom towards the entrance. "Yeah, just helping Tom get out of the cold." Sarah's eyes darted nervously up the street, towards the looming shadow of Winter Hill. The old mansion had stood abandoned for as long as anyone in town could remember. Its decrepit Victorian bulk a constant presence on the horizon. "Well, come on in then. It's not a night to be outside." As we stepped into the bar, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the fog. I glanced back and for a split second could have sworn I saw a pale face peering out of the mist, dark eyes locked onto mine. Then Sarah shut the door, and the image was gone. Inside, the bar was unusually crowded for a Tuesday night. It seemed half the town had decided to seek refuge from the unseasonable chill. Conversations hushed as we entered, and I felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon us. "What's going on?" I asked, helping Tom into a seat at the bar. "Why's everyone so on edge?" Sarah busied herself pouring a cup of coffee for Tom, avoiding my gaze. "It's nothing. Just this weather, gets people talking." But I could tell she was lying. There was a tension in the air, a sense of barely contained fear that seemed to vibrate through the room. I was about to press further when the lights flickered, once, twice, and then went out completely. In the sudden darkness, someone screamed. And then, carried on a gust of frigid air that shouldn't have been possible inside the bar, I heard it. A whisper, so faint I might have imagined it. Somehow, I knew I hadn't. "James Thorne," it hissed, the sound seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "We've been waiting for you." The lights came back on as suddenly as they'd gone out. Everyone was looking around wildly, their faces pale with shock. But I knew, somehow, that I was the only one who'd heard the voice. As conversation slowly resumed, an uneasy normalcy settling back over the bar, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed irrevocably. That in that moment of darkness, a door had been opened that could never truly be closed again. I looked out the window, towards the hulking silhouette of Winter Hill, barely visible through the fog. Whatever was up there, whatever had called my name, I knew with a bone-deep certainty that this was only the beginning. The ghosts of Winter Hill were stirring, and for reasons I couldn't begin to fathom, they knew who I was. And they were waiting for me. The next morning dawned gray and cold, the fog still clinging to the streets of Millbrook like a damp shroud. I hadn't slept well, my dreams plagued by whispers and fleeting glimpses of pale faces in the darkness. As I made my way to the local diner for some much-needed coffee, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Bell above the door chimed as I entered Millie's diner. The usual morning crowd was there. Farmers grabbing breakfast before heading out to their fields, fishermen fueling up for a day on the water. But the usual cheerful chatter was subdued, placed by hushed conversations and furtive glances. I slid onto a stool at the counter, and Millie herself appeared before me, coffee pot in hand. She was a stout woman in her 60s, with silver hair and kind eyes that always seemed to hold a hint of sadness. "Rough night, James?" she asked, pouring me a steaming cup. I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "Could say that. Millie, what's going on in this town? Everyone seems scared." Millie's eyes darted to the other patrons, then back to me. She leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's the hill, James. Things happen when the fog comes in like this. Best to stay inside after dark. Keep your doors locked." Before I could press her for more information, the bell chimed again. A hush fell over the diner as Sheriff Dan Hawkins walked in, his craggy face set in grim lines. He nodded to a few regulars before making his way to me. "Mr. Thorne," he said, voice gruff. "Mind if we have a word outside?" I followed him out onto the sidewalk, my stomach churning with a mixture of curiosity and dread. The sheriff was silent for a moment, staring up at the barely visible outline of Winter Hill. "You're new here," Emily said, "so you don't know how things work in Millbrook. When the fog comes in like this, people stay home. They don't go wandering around at night, and they certainly don't go anywhere near that hill." I bristled at his tone. "With all due respect, Sheriff, I'm not a child. I can take care of myself." Hawkins turned to me, his eyes hard. "This isn't about you being able to take care of yourself. This is about the safety of the whole town. Strange things happen when that fog rolls in. People go missing, and sometimes they come back, changed." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the voice from the night before, the one that had known my name. "What do you mean, changed?" The sheriff's expression softened slightly. "Look, I know how this must sound, but Millbrook has a history, one that goes back centuries. That house up there," he nodded towards Winter Hill, "it's been the source of trouble for generations. Just trust me when I say it's best left alone." As if on cue, a gust of wind cut through the fog, bearing with it the faint sound of laughter, high, cold, and utterly inhuman. Hawkins and I both turned towards the hill. The sound was gone as quickly as it had come. "You heard that, didn't you?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Hawkins nodded, his face pale. "Go home, Mr. Thorne. Lock your doors, close your curtains, and whatever you do, don't answer if anyone comes knocking after dark. Not unless you're damn sure you know who it is." With that, he turned and strode back to his patrol car, leaving me alone on the sidewalk. As I watched him drive away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he wasn't telling me. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, going through the motions of my normal routine, unable to focus on anything. The sheriff's warning played on repeat in my mind, along with the memory of that eerie laughter. As evening approached, the fog seemed to thicken, muffling the sounds of the town and turning familiar streets into twisted, alien landscapes. I hurried home, my key already in hand as I approached my small rented house. Just as I reached the porch, I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the street behind me. I turned, peering into the mist, could see nothing but swirling gray. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding small and frightened in the unnatural silence. Footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, carried on another gust of that bone-chilling wind, I heard a voice. The same one from the bar, but clearer now, filled with a terrible hunger. "James Thorne," it said, seeming to come from everywhere at once. "We're waiting for you. Come to us. Come home." I fumbled with my key, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get it into the lock. As I finally wrenched the door open, I caught a glimpse of movement in the fog. Tall, impossibly thin figure, gliding towards me with unnatural speed. I slammed the door shut, locking it and leaning against it, my heart pounding. Outside, I heard those slow, deliberate footsteps climb my porch steps. Something scratched at the door, a sound like nails on wood that sent shivers down my spine. "You can't hide from us forever, James," the voice whispered, seeming to come from just on the other side of the door. "We are patient. We have waited so long, and now you're finally here." I closed my eyes, praying for it to go away, for this all to be some horrible nightmare. When I opened them again, the scratching had stopped. I peered out the window but saw nothing but fog. As I sank to the floor, my back still against the door, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Whatever was happening in Millbrook, whatever dwelled on Winter Hill, it wanted me. And sooner or later, I would have to face it. But not tonight. Tonight, I would heed the sheriff's warning. I would lock my doors, close my curtains, and pray for the dawn. Little did I know, dawn would bring horrors of its own. I must have fallen asleep at some point, my back still pressed against the front door. When I awoke, pale morning light was filtering through the curtain. The fog outside seemed to have thinned somewhat. As I stumbled to my feet, wincing at the stiffness in my muscles, my eyes fell on a crisp white envelope that had been slipped under the door. My name was written on it in elegant, flowing script. With trembling hands, I picked it up and tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper. Message was brief. "Mr. James Thorne, your presence is cordially requested at Winter Hill Manor this evening at 8 o'clock sharp. Formal attire is required. We eagerly await your arrival. Yours sincerely, the Thorne family." I read the invitation several times, my mind reeling. The Thorne family? As far as I knew, I had no living relatives. And why would they be at Winter Hill? Despite the sheriff's warnings, despite the terrifying events of the previous night, I felt an undeniable pull towards the old mansion. There were too many unanswered questions, too many strange coincidences. I needed to know the truth. I spent the day in a state of nervous anticipation, pacing my small house and jumping at every sound. As evening approached, I found myself standing before my closet, staring at the one suit I owned. A remnant from my life in Boston that I'd never expected to wear again in this small coastal town. At 7:30, I stepped out into the gathering darkness. Fog had returned, thicker than ever, swallowing the streetlights and muffling my footsteps. As I made my way towards Winter Hill, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap. The old mansion loomed before me, a dark silhouette against the night sky. As I approached, I saw warm light spilling from the windows, and the faint strains of music drifted through the air. It was as if the decrepit old house had suddenly come to life. I hesitated at the foot of the grand staircase leading up to the front door. This was my last chance to turn back, to heed the warnings and stay away from whatever secrets Winter Hill held. But I couldn't. I'd come too far, and the pull of the unknown was too strong. I climbed the stairs and raised the heavy brass knocker. Before I could let it fall, the door swung open silently. A tall, gaunt man in an impeccable butler's uniform stood before me. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "We've been expecting you. Please come in." As I stepped over the threshold, I felt a chill run down my spine. The foyer was grand, with a sweeping staircase and glittering chandeliers. But there was something off about it all. The furnishings seemed to waver at the edges of my vision, as if they weren't quite solid. "The others are waiting in the ballroom," the butler said, gesturing down a long hallway. "Please follow me." As we walked, I caught glimpses of other rooms. A library with towering bookshelves, a dining room set for a feast, conservatory filled with plants I'd never seen before. But it was all wrong somehow. Like a dream, just beginning to fray at the edges. We reached a set of ornate double doors, and the butler paused, turning to me with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Welcome home, Mr. Thorne," he said, and pushed the doors open. The ballroom was filled with people, all dressed in elegant evening wear that seemed to belong to another century. As I entered, the music stopped, and every head turned towards me. I froze, my heart pounding, as I took in the scene before me. Every face was pale, almost translucent, with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to glow with an inner light. And every single one of them was smiling at me, a hungry, anticipatory smile that sent shivers down my spine. From the crowd, a woman stepped forward. She was beautiful in a cold, otherworldly way, her long black hair flowing around her like smoke. "James," she said, her voice the same one I'd heard whispering my name. "We've been waiting so long for you to come home." As she reached out to me, her hand pale and insubstantial in the flickering light, I realized with a jolt of terror that I could see right through her. These weren't people at all. They were ghosts, and somehow, impossibly, they believed I was one of them. The doors slammed shut behind me, and I knew with a sinking certainty that my night of horrors had only just begun. The ghostly woman's hand closed around my wrist, her touch like ice seeping into my bones. I tried to pull away, but her grip was impossibly strong. "Don't be afraid, James," he said, her voice echoing strangely in the cavernous ballroom. "We're your family. We've waited so long for you to return to us." My mind reeled as I looked around the room. Dozens of pale, translucent faces stared back at me, all bearing an unsettling familiarity. I saw my own eyes, my father's nose, my grandmother's chin reflected back at me in these spectral visages. "This isn't possible," I whispered, my voice shaking. "You're not real. None of this is real." A man stepped forward, his antiquated suit and stern expression reminiscent of a daguerreotype I'd once seen of my great-grandfather. "We are as real as you are, James," he said, his voice resonating with authority. "We are the Thornes who came before, and you are the last of our line." The ghostly woman, still gripping my wrist, began to pull me further into the room. The crowd parted, forming a path to a large portrait hanging on the far wall. As we approached, I felt my blood run cold. The painting depicted a family, a stern-faced man, a serene woman, and between them, a young boy of perhaps 10 or 11. The boy's face was my own. "You don't remember, do you?" the woman said softly. "The accident, the fall, the years you spent away from us, living a life that was never truly yours." Memories began to surface, hazy and indistinct. A childhood spent in this very house, the creaking of old boards, the whisper of unseen presences, a sense of never quite belonging in the world outside. "No," I said, shaking my head violently. "This isn't right. I grew up in Boston. My parents died when I was young. My grandmother raised me." The man who resembled my great-grandfather shook his head sadly. "A necessary deception to keep you safe until you were ready to return to us. Your grandmother was one of us, tasked with guiding you back when the time was right." I thought of the old woman who had raised me, her sad eyes and the way she would sometimes stare off into space, as if seeing things I couldn't. Had it all been a lie? "But I'm alive," I insisted, though my voice lacked conviction. "I'm not like you. I'm not dead." A ripple of what might have been laughter passed through the ghostly assembly. The woman holding my wrist smiled, a sad, knowing smile. "Are you so sure, James? Think. Really think. When was the last time you felt truly alive?" I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died on my lips. I thought about my life in Millbrook, fog that seemed to cloud my memories, the way time seemed to slip by without meaning. Had I ever really lived since coming to this town? As if sensing my doubt, the woman released my wrist and stepped back. "It's time for you to remember, James. Time for you to take your place among us." The room began to spin, faces of my spectral ancestors blurring into a pale, whirling mass. I felt myself falling through layers of memory and time. I saw flashes of a life long forgotten, running through the halls of Winter Hill as a child, listening to ghostly stories by firelight, learning secrets that no living person was meant to know. And then I saw the axe. Dare. Foolish climb to the highest tower of Winter Hill. Crumbling stone beneath my feet. A terrifying moment of freefall. And then, darkness. I gasped, coming back to myself in the ballroom. But everything had changed. The room seemed brighter now, more solid. I could hear the music clearly, could smell the subtle perfumes of the ghostly women and the pipe smoke of the men. I raised my hand before my face and saw, with a mixture of horror and wonder, that it had taken on the same translucent quality as the others. "Welcome home, James," woman said, and I recognized her now, my mother, as she had been in life. "Are you ready to begin your true existence?" As the ghosts of Winter Hill closed in around me, their cold embraces feeling more real than anything I'd experienced in years, I realized the terrifying truth. I hadn't come to Winter Hill to uncover its secrets. I had come to become one of them. Time lost all meaning in Winter Hill. Days, perhaps weeks, blurred together in a haze of spectral revelry and supernatural tutelage. I learned the ways of the ghost world, how to move through walls, how to appear to the living, how to feed on their fear and wonder. My family, for I now knew them to be just that, taught me the history of our lineage. The Thornes had always straddled the line between the world of the living and the dead, keepers of ancient secrets and dark magic. Winter Hill was our anchor, a place where the veil between worlds was thinnest. But as I settled into this new existence, a gnawing doubt began to grow in the pit of my stomach. Was this truly who I was meant to be? Had my entire life been leading to this moment, this transformation into a being neither fully dead nor alive? It was my mother who first noticed my unease. She found me in the library one night, poring over old family journals, searching for something. I wasn't even sure what. "You're troubled, James," she said, her form shimmering in the candlelight. "Speak your mind." I closed the book I'd been reading, sighing. "I don't know if I can do this," I admitted. "Live this half-life, trapped between worlds. Don't you ever miss being truly alive?" A shadow passed over her face. "We all do at times," he said softly. "But this is our duty, our destiny. We are the guardians of the veil, keepers of secrets too dangerous for the living to know." "But at what cost?" I asked, standing up and pacing the room. My feet made no sound on the old wooden floors. "We terrify the town. People go missing. Lives are ruined. Is that really our purpose?" My mother's expression hardened. "It is necessary," she said, her voice taking on an otherworldly resonance. "The power we guard must be protected at all costs. The living cannot be allowed to meddle in affairs beyond their understanding." I shook my head, unconvinced. There has to be another way. A way to protect the secrets without causing harm. "You are young, James," she said, her tone softening. "In time, you will understand. For now, trust in your family. Trust in your heritage." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The more I learned about the Thorne family's history, the more I began to question everything I'd been told. Late one night, as the rest of the spectral household was engaged in one of their endless parties, I slipped away to the highest tower of Winter Hill, the place where I had supposedly fallen to my death as a child. As I climbed the winding stairs, memories began to surface. But they weren't the memories of a happy child exploring his family home. They were darker, filled with fear and confusion. I remembered hiding from angry voices, cowering in dark corners as arcane rituals were performed. I remembered being told I had a great destiny, that I was special, chosen. And I remembered the night I tried to run away. I reached the top of the tower, my incorporeal form passing through the locked door as if it wasn't there. The room beyond was small and circular, with a large window overlooking the town of Millbrook. This was where it had happened. Not an accident, but a desperate attempt to escape. I hadn't fallen. I had jumped. As the full weight of this realization hit me, I felt something shift within my spectral form. The world around me seemed to flicker, reality bending and warping. And then, for the first time since I'd entered Winter Hill, I felt my heart beat. I gasped, the sensation of air filling my lungs almost painful after so long without it. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling the steady thump of a heart I'd thought long stilled. I was alive. Truly, fully alive. But even as joy surged through me, I heard the angry howl of the wind picking up around the tower. The temperature dropped precipitously, and I knew with chilling certainty that my family, the ghosts of Winter Hill, were aware of what had happened. They would not let me go easily. The choice I now faced was simple, yet monumental. Embrace the half-life of a Thorne, or fight for my right to truly live. As the spectral forms of my ancestors began to materialize around me, their faces twisted with rage and betrayal, I knew the real battle for my soul was only just beginning. The air in the tower crackled with supernatural energy as my ghostly relatives converged upon me. Their once welcoming faces were now masks of fury and betrayal. My mother pushed to the front of the group, her eyes blazing with an otherworldly fire. "James," she hissed, her voice a mixture of anger and desperation. "What have you done?" I backed away, my newly beating heart pounding in my chest. "I've chosen life," I said, surprised by the strength in my voice. "This isn't right, what we've been doing, what you've all been doing for generations. It has to stop." My great-grandfather's spirit moved forward, his form seeming to grow larger and more menacing. "You fool," growled. "You have no idea of the forces you're dealing with. power we protect, the balance we maintain. It's all for the greater good. Greater good? I scoffed, anger giving me courage. Terrorizing a town? Trapping souls? That's not good, it's monstrous. A chorus of outraged cries rose from the assembled ghosts. They began to close in, the temperature in the room plummeting. I could see my breath misting in the air as I franched frantically for an escape route. My eyes fell on the window behind me. Beyond it, I could see the lights of Millbrook twinkling in the distance. Freedom was so close, yet so terrifyingly far. "Please," my mother said, her voice softening. "James, darling, you don't understand. If you leave, if you break the cycle, the consequences will be catastrophic. Not just for us, but for the whole world." For a moment I hesitated. What if she was right? What if there really was some greater purpose to all this? But then I remembered the fear in the eyes of the Millbrook residents, the whispered warnings, the lives disrupted by the malevolent presence on the hill. No. Whatever the original intention might have been, the Thornes had become something dark and twisted. "I'm sorry," I said, meeting my mother's gaze, "but I can't be a part of this." Before anyone could react, I turned and ran for the window. I heard my mother's scream of no, just as I crashed through the glass, shards sparkling around me as I plummeted towards the ground. For a terrifying moment, I was sure I had made a fatal mistake. The ground rushed up to meet me, and I closed my eyes, bracing for impact. But it never came. I opened my eyes to find myself floating, suspended in midair a few feet above the ground. The ghostly abilities I had learned hadn't completely abandoned me. I didn't have time to marvel at this discovery. Above me, I could hear the enraged howls of my spectral family. I needed to run, and fast. I hit the ground running, my feet carrying me down the overgrown path that led away from Winter Hill. Behind me, I could hear the storm of supernatural energy building, the very air seeming to vibrate with the fury of the ghosts. Trees whipped past me as I ran, branches scratching at my face and arms. I was alive, gloriously, painfully alive, and I intended to stay that way. As I neared the town, I risked a glance back. What I saw nearly stopped me in my tracks. Winter Hill was transforming. The once decrepit mansion was now a swirling vortex of spectral energy, its walls seeming to breathe and pulse, and pouring out of every window and door were the ghosts. Not just my family, but hundreds of spirits, all in pursuit. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. I had to warn the town. I had to find help. But who would believe me? As I burst onto Main Street, I saw a familiar figure locking up the bar. Sarah turned at the sound of my approach, her eyes widening in shock. "James? What on earth?" "No time," I gasped, grabbing her arm. "We need to get everyone out. Now. They're coming." Sarah looked past me towards the hill, and her face drained of color. "Oh my God," she whispered. The storm of spirits was visible now, a terrifying spectacle of swirling, screaming forms descending upon the town. Windows shattered as the first wave hit, car alarms blaring to life in a cacophony of noise. "The church," Sarah said suddenly, pulling me along. "Everyone knows to go to the church when things get bad." As we ran through the panicking streets, I saw other townspeople emerging from their homes, all moving in the same direction. The old church stood on a small rise at the edge of town, its weathered spire reaching towards the sky. We burst through the doors to find the church already filling with scared, confused people. Sheriff Hawkins was there, trying to maintain some semblance of order. His eyes locked onto me, narrowing with suspicion. "You," said, striding over. "What did you do?" Before I could answer, a bone-chilling scream split the air. Through the stained glass windows, we could see the storm of spirits surrounding the church, battering against some invisible barrier. "They can't get in," one whispered. "The church is safe." For how long, I wondered, and what would happen to those who hadn't made it to safety? As the ghosts of Winter Hill raged outside, I knew that this was far from over. Somehow I had to find a way to end this, once and for all. But as I looked around at the terrified faces of the townspeople, I realized I couldn't do it alone. The real battle for Millbrook, and for my soul, was about to begin. The church creaked and groaned under the onslaught of spectral energy, but its walls held firm. Inside, the air was thick with fear and confusion. I stood near the altar, all eyes on me, as I tried to explain the impossible situation we found ourselves in. "So you're telling us," Sheriff Hawkins said, his voice heavy with disbelief, "that you're part of some ancient family of ghosts, and now they're angry because you've decided to... what? Come back to life?" But that way, it did sound absurd. But the howling maelstrom outside lent credence to my wild tale. "I know it sounds crazy," I said, running a hand through my hair, "but it's the truth. And right now, we need to focus on how to stop them." Sarah stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "I believe him," she said, addressing the crowd. "We've all known there was something wrong with Winter Hill. Now we know what it is." A murmur ran through the gathered townspeople. Old Tom, surprisingly sober given the circumstances, spoke up. "Aye, the boy's right. My granddad used to tell stories about the Thornes, said they weren't natural, that they guarded some great power." "Power," I mused, a memory surfacing. "That's it. There's something in the house, something my family has been protecting for generations. If we can find it, maybe we can stop all this." Sheriff Hawkins shook his head. "You want us to go back out there, into that?" He gestured towards the windows where the spectral storm continued to rage. "Not all of us," I said. "I'll go. I know the house. I might be able to." "No," Sarah interrupted. "You're not going alone. I'm coming with you." One by one, others stepped forward. Tom, a few of the younger men from town, even Millie from the diner. Sheriff Hawkins looked at the volunteers and sighed heavily. "Well, I can't let you all go running off into danger without me," he grumbled. "But we need a plan. And weapons." The next hour was a flurry of activity. Those with knowledge of the occult shared what they knew. Old books were brought out, family heirlooms that had been hidden away for generations. Iron pokers were distributed. "Old iron," Tom explained. "Spirits don't like it." As our ragtag group prepared to venture out, I pulled Sarah aside. "You don't have to do this," I said softly. "It's not your fight." She met my eyes, her gaze steady. "Became my fight the moment those things attacked our town. Besides," she added with a small smile, "someone has to make sure you don't do anything stupid." Finally, we were as ready as we'd ever be. I looked at our group, a mix of determined faces and trembling hands clutching makeshift weapons. It wasn't much, but it was all we had. "Remember," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the supernatural storm outside. "We get to the house, find whatever artifact or object is the source of their power, and destroy it. Don't let them touch you, and don't listen to anything they say. They'll try to confuse you, to make you doubt yourself." Sheriff Hawkins stepped up beside me, his shotgun loaded with salt rounds. "All right, folks, this is it. Stay together, watch each other's backs, and pray." With a nod to Father Matthews, who began to recite a prayer in Latin, we pushed open the church doors and stepped out into chaos. The world outside was a nightmare landscape. Spectral forms swooped and dove through the air, their unearthly screams setting our teeth on edge. The very fabric of reality seemed to waver, buildings and streets flickering like bad television reception. We moved as one, tight group with Sheriff Hawkins and me in the lead. The ghosts seemed momentarily taken aback by our emergence, but it didn't last long. As we made our way towards Winter Hill, they regrouped, their attacks becoming more focused. I saw faces I recognized in the swirling mass, distant ancestors, spirits I had communed with during my time in the house. And there, at the forefront, were my parents, their expressions a mix of rage and pleading. "James," my mother's voice cut through the chaos. "Stop this madness. Come back to us. It's not too late." Gritted my teeth, pushing forward. "Don't listen to them," I shouted to the others. "Keep moving." As we neared the base of the hill, the attacks intensified. Millie cried out as a spirit passed through her, old woman stumbling and nearly falling. Caught her, iron poker swinging wildly at the attacking ghost. "We can't take much more of this," Sheriff Hawkins grunted, firing another salt round into the swirling mass. He was right. We were outnumbered, outmatched. But we were also the only hope Millbrook had. With a renewed surge of determination, I pointed towards the looming silhouette of Winter Hill Manor. "We're almost there. Just a little further." As we began our ascent up the hill, I silently prayed that we weren't walking into an even greater nightmare. Whatever power lay hidden in that house, it had better be worth the price we were paying to reach it. The fate of Millbrook, and possibly much more, hung in the balance. And I had a sinking feeling that the true test was yet to come. The grand doors of Winter Hill Manor loomed before us, their once pristine surface now warped and twisted by supernatural energies. The wood seemed to pulse with an inner light, veins of spectral energy running through it like corrupt arteries. "How do we get in?" Sarah shouted over the howling wind, her hair whipping wildly around her face. I stepped forward, placing my hand on the door. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the house, the door swung open. "It still recognizes me," I murmured, chill running down my spine. We rushed inside, Sheriff Hawkins and Tom slamming the doors shut behind us. The sudden silence was almost as deafening as the storm outside had been. The foyer was just as I remembered it, but like the exterior, it was warped by the unleashed power. Portraits on the walls writhed, the painted figures contorting in silent screams. The grand staircase twisted upwards in an impossible spiral. "What now?" Millie asked, her voice trembling. Closed my eyes, trying to remember. There had been something, a room I was never allowed to enter as a child, a place spoken of in hushed whispers. "The basement," I said, my eyes snapping open. "There's a hidden room in the basement, that's where it must be." We made our way deeper into the house, our small group huddled close together. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat, every creak of the floorboards a prelude to an attack. As we descended the stairs to the basement, the air grew thick and heavy. Mist swirled around our feet, and the temperature dropped dramatically. "There," I pointed to a section of wall that looked no different from any other. Behind that wall. Sheriff Hawkins stepped forward, running his hands over the smooth surface. "I don't see any." His words were cut off as the wall suddenly dissolved, revealing a hidden passage beyond. Cold blue light spilled out, illuminating our shocked faces. "Well," Tom said, gripping his iron poker tightly, "that's not ominous at all." We entered the hidden room, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. The chamber was circular, its walls covered in intricate, glowing symbols. In the center stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a small, unassuming box. "That's it," I whispered, taking a step towards the pedestal. "That has to be the source." But before I could reach it, the air in the room began to shimmer. Spectral forms materialized around us, my family, the guardians of Winter Hill. "James," my father's ghost said, his voice echoing strangely in the chamber. "Think about what you're doing. The power contained in that box has been our burden, our duty to protect for generations. You can't simply destroy it." "He's right," my mother added, her form flickering like a candle flame. "The consequences could be catastrophic, not just for us, but for the entire world." I hesitated, doubt creeping into my mind. What if they were right? What if destroying the box would unleash something even worse? Sarah's hand on my arm snapped me out of my reverie. "Don't listen to them, James," she said fiercely. "Look what guarding this power has done to them, to this town. Whatever's in that box, it's not worth the cost." She was right. I steeled myself and took another step towards the pedestal. "I'm sorry," I said to the ghosts of my family, "but this ends now." As my hand closed around the box, the room erupted into chaos. The ghosts surged forward, their wails of anguish and rage filling the air. My companions fought back with their iron weapons and salt. We were grossly outnumbered. I clutched the box to my chest, feeling its power thrumming through me. But how to destroy it? In my moment of indecision, a spectral hand closed around my throat, icy fingers sapping my strength. "The fire!" Sheriff Hawkins shouted, gesturing to a brazier in the corner of the room that had flared to life. Flames and unnatural blue. The last of my strength, I hurled the box into the flames. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the box began to glow, brighter and brighter, until it was painful to look at. A high-pitched whine filled the air, drowning out even the screams of the ghosts. The light from the box grew to blinding intensity, and I felt a wave of energy pulse outward. And then, darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of the basement. The hidden room was gone, as were the ghosts. My companions were slowly stirring around me, looking dazed but unharmed. "Is it over?" Millie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I stood on shaky legs and made my way up the basement stairs. The others followed close behind. As we emerged into the foyer, I saw that the house had been transformed. Gone were the twisted, nightmarish features. It looked normal, old and in need of repair, but just a house. We stepped outside onto the porch. The spectral storm had dissipated, leaving behind a clear, star-filled sky. In the distance, I could see lights coming on in town as people cautiously emerged from their shelters. "We did it," Sarah said, a note of wonder in her voice. "It's really over." As we made our way down the hill, couldn't help but look back at Winter Hill Manor. For the first time in generations, it stood silent and still, its secrets finally laid to rest. But as the adrenaline of our ordeal began to fade, a new worry took root in my mind. Ghosts were gone, the supernatural threat neutralized. But what would happen now? To the town, the people who had lived so long in the shadow of Winter Hill. And what about me? I had rejected my spectral heritage, chosen life over the half-existence my family had embraced. But where did I fit in now? As we reached the bottom of the hill, I realized that destroying the source of Winter Hill's power wasn't the end of the story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. The days following what would come to be known as the Night of Spirits were a blur of activity. As news of the events at Winter Hill spread, Millbrook found itself thrust into an unwelcome spotlight. Reporters and paranormal investigators descended on the small town, eager for a story that seemed too fantastical to be true. Sheriff Hawkins did his best to manage the situation, fielding questions and turning away the more persistent outsider. But it was clear that Millbrook would never be the same. For my part, I found myself caught between two worlds. The townspeople, once wary of the newcomer, now looked to me for answers. I had gone from outsider to reluctant hero overnight, and the weight of their expectations was almost as heavy as the burden I'd carried as a thorn. A week after that fateful night, I stood on the porch of the Rusty Anchor, watching as another news van rolled out of town. Sarah joined me, handing me a steaming mug of coffee. "Quite a circus, huh?" she said, leaning against the railing. I nodded, taking a sip of the coffee. "How long do you think it'll last?" Sarah shrugged. "Hard to say, but eventually they'll move on to the next big story. And then we'll have to figure out how to live with what happened." I finished. We stood in companionable silence for a while, watching as the town slowly returned to some semblance of normalcy. But there was an undercurrent of change in the air, a sense that Millbrook was on the cusp of something new. "Have you decided what you're going to do?" Sarah asked, her voice soft. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "I don't know. Part of me wants to leave, to get as far away from Winter Hill as possible. But this is home now," she finished for me. I looked at her, surprised by the rush of warmth I felt. In the chaos of the past week, I hadn't had time to examine my growing feelings for Sarah, but they were there, undeniable and comforting. "Yeah," I said. "I guess it is." The next day, I made my way up to Winter Hill. The old mansion stood silent and empty, its windows dark. But as I approached, I didn't feel the dread that had once accompanied this journey. Instead, there was a sense of possibility. I stood before the front door, key in hand. After a moment's hesitation, I unlocked it and stepped inside. The foyer was dusty and filled with shadows, but it no longer felt oppressive. I made my way through the rooms, memories, both good and bad, surfacing with each step. In what had once been the library, I found a leather-bound journal, pages filled with the elegant script of generations of Thornes. As I flipped through it, an idea began to form. 2 months later, Winter Hill Manor opened its doors once again. But this time, it wasn't as a home for ghosts and dark secret. Instead, it had been transformed into a museum and research center dedicated to the paranormal history of Millbrook and the surrounding area. The opening day saw a line of visitors stretching down the hill. I stood at the entrance, greeting people alongside Sarah, who had become both my partner in the venture and in life. As I watched families and curious individuals explore the exhibits we had curated, artifacts from the town's history, accounts of supernatural encounters, and yes, even the story of the Thorne family, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. We hadn't erased the past. We had embraced it, learned from it. The power that had once been a curse was now being used to educate and inspire. That night, as Sarah and I stood on the porch of our small house in town, looking up at the now welcoming lights of Winter Hill, I realized that I had finally found my place in the world. I was James Thorne, the last of my line. But I was also James Thorne, curator of history, protector of stories, and bridge between two worlds. The ghosts of Winter Hill were gone, but their legacy lived on through me. And as I looked to the future, hand in hand with Sarah, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, I would face them not as a ghost, not as a reluctant heir to a supernatural legacy, but as a man. A man with a past, yes, but also with a future full of possibilities. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faintest echo of long-forgotten voices. But now, instead of fear, they brought a sense of continuity. Stories waiting to be told. Winter Hill had been a place of darkness for so long, but now, finally, it stood as a beacon of light, illuminating the shadows of the past, guiding us toward a brighter future.